Welcome back. Today we are looking at round 2 of the 2026 Prague International Chess Festival, where David Anton Guijarro opens the game with d4 against Jordan Van Forest. Knight f6, c4, g6, preparing to fianchetto the dark squared bishop. White has a few options here. Instead of the most challenging main lines, white could opt for a solid setup with knight f3 or even g3. Knight c3, bishop g7. Black is just focused on getting the king to safety. White could develop quietly here with knight f3. Or play bishop g5, which is known as the Averbach variation. e4, d6, and we have the King's Indian defense on the board. This is a super aggressive, hyper-modern setup by Jordan. White has a ton of options now. The main line is knight f3, but f3, the same-ish variation, or bishop e2 are also very popular choices. David goes for h3! This is known as the Makaganov variation of the King's Indian. White wants to restrict Black's light-squared bishop and prepare a solid center. Black usually continues development with castles or challenges the center immediately with c5. Jordan strikes right at the center with e5. This instantly challenges White's control and asks a major question. Are you going to push, trade, or just keep the tension? White plays pawn to d5, clamping down on the center. By pushing this pawn, White is basically saying, we are playing a positional game today, while grabbing a very nice space advantage. Black responds with pawn to a5. This is a very classic idea in these closed structures, looking to secure the c5 square for a piece later on. White just brings the knight to f3. Simple, solid development. Black swings the knight to a6. Remember that pawn push we just saw? This knight is clearly dreaming of jumping into that juicy c5 outpost. White plays the bishop to d3, aiming it towards the king side and getting ready to tuck the king away. Black castles. Getting the king out of the center before things get too crazy is always a smart idea. White follows suit and castles as well. Black spends nearly 5 minutes here and plays the knight back to d7. It looks weird to retreat, but Black is clearing the way for the f-pawn to push, which is really your main source of counterplay in these setups. White sinks almost 20 minutes into this move, pawn to a3. Taking that much time for a pawn move means White is taking this position incredibly seriously, taking away the b4 square and preparing to handle Black's queenside ideas. Black immediately drops the knight onto c5. It's a gorgeous outpost for the horse. White drops the bishop back to c2. You really don't want to trade your good bishop for that knight. Here comes the strike. Black plays pawn to f5 after a massive 15-minute think. This is the whole point of Black's setup. Blow up the kingside and create total chaos. White plays bishop to g5, directly attacking the queen. The immediate threat is simply to take the queen on d8. Black slides the queen over to e8 to step out of the attack. But this also prepares a sneaky idea. If left alone, Black wants to push the pawn to f4, locking down the kingside and expanding their space. White jumps the knight to b5, putting immediate pressure on the c7 pawn. If Black ignores this, White is setting a vicious trap. The idea is to take the pawn on c7, which directly attacks the queen. After the queen moves to safety, White will just gobble up the rook in the corner. Black retreats the knight all the way back to a6 to defend the c7 pawn. It's passive, but it secures the position and renews the threat to push the pawn to f4. White captures on f5. This is necessary to stop the pawn from pushing to f4, which would have cramped White's pieces. It also prepares White's next attacking idea, jumping the knight to h4. Black recaptures with the g-pawn. White spends 21 minutes on knight to h4. David is setting a serious problem for Black. The immediate threat is to simply capture the pawn on f5. If Black isn't careful, the kingside defenses will start crumbling, and White will dominate the light squares. Black pushes pawn to e4. Not only does this stop White's plan to capture on f5, but it beautifully blocks the vision of White's light-squared bishop and gives Black some breathing room. White slides the queen to e2. Black centralizes the knight to e5. That knight is an absolute monster right in the middle of the board. White brings the rook to d1. Centralizing the pieces is never a bad idea. Black develops the light-squared bishop to d7. White plays pawn to b3 instantly, just blunting any potential queenside counterplay. Black plays rook to c8. Now, Jordan spent almost 10 minutes on this, but it's a mistake. The rook just isn't doing much on this square. The engine prefers challenging White's structure on the queenside with pawn to a4. However, Black's actual idea here is to prepare pushing the f-pawn to f4. White steps right into the tension and strikes with pawn to f4. The idea is extremely direct. White is threatening to capture the knight on e5, blowing the center wide open. Black avoids the capture and retreats the knight to f7. This is a bit of an inaccuracy, but Black is setting up a direct counterattack. The idea is to kick the bishop away with pawn to h6. White centralizes the knight to d4, putting a stop to Black's plans. The pieces are swarming like angry bees. White is now setting up a massive tactical shot. The threat is to sacrifice the knight on f5, completely ripping apart Black's pawn shelter. Oh no, Black plays pawn to h6. Jordan spent over 12 minutes on this, but it's a massive blunder that completely compromises the king's safety. It was absolutely critical to play bishop takes d4, removing that monster knight from the center. Instead, by pushing this pawn, Black invites disaster. Let's look at a better variation. Black could have played the knight to take on g5, then the white pawn would recapture, and bishop would take on d4 with check. This would look much better. Okay, now let's get back to the game. Boom! White instantly sacrifices the knight, capturing on f5. The threat here is vicious. White wants to play knight to e7 check, which creates a brutal fork. If Black allows this, White wins material and totally destroys the position. Black accepts the sacrifice and takes the bishop on g5. But this just makes things worse. It's another blunder. The only way to try and survive was bishop takes d4, removing that monster knight from the center. Now, White's attack is about to become unstoppable. White captures the bishop on g7! This completely strips the dark squares around the Black king. Without that defensive bishop, the king is completely naked. Plus, White is now directly threatening to chop off the queen on e8. Black recaptures with the king to save the queen. What else can you do? White crashes in with knight to e6 check. A beautiful outpost, completely paralyzing Black. Black has to chop it off with the bishop. White completely ignores the bishop and snatches the pawn with queen takes e4. It's panic time for Black. White is setting up a lethal mating net. The immediate threat is to slide the queen to g6 check. If Black ignores this, the king gets forced to the corner and it is checkmate. Black desperately drops the bishop back to f5, stepping in front of the queen to stop the mate on g6. But it also attacks the white queen, threatening to take it. White just snatches the bishop with the queen! The attack is completely overwhelming now, and the threat of queen to g6 check, followed by mate on h7, is right back on the menu. Black gives a spite check with the queen on e3. When you're losing, sometimes you just throw a check to feel something. However, this is technically a mistake. The only stubborn defense was rook to h8, bringing a defender over to cover the critical h7 square. The white king casually steps aside to h1, stepping out of check and keeping the brutal mating threat of queen to g6 alive. Black plays rook to h8, desperately trying to cover the mating square on h7. White slides the rook over to e1. This is the final nail in the coffin. The white rook is staring down the black queen, and White threatens to just capture it on e3. Black is totally busted, and the attack is unstoppable. What an absolutely wild finish. I think this game was a perfect example of how pawn pushes in front of your king can go horribly wrong if you miscalculate. David Anton Guijarro showed incredible patience before unleashing that devastating sacrifice. Let me know in the comments if you would have found that knight sacrifice in your own games. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.